I'm a bit aware of how jarring this must be for some people, talking about all these big issues and then going to marketing. But it completely relates.
Well, and what we're not saying, I think, is we're not saying that, in your previous, you know, illustration about, customers, they're just a number and things like this.
Yeah.
We're not saying we obsess over everybody or anything like that. I think what we're saying is that we know our place. We don't overpromise that, and then we make sure that our ethos, our values, let's say, are aligned with what we can actually do and fulfill. And when I think about truth, and I think about when I think about research and like marketing, especially research, you asked earlier how I was able to kind of maintain my frame even in a secular university, a Marxist, straight up Marxist grad school, and then an industry that I didn't think I could actually work in once I realized what it was and got out of school, because it's so it's not realist, it's idealist, and but part of it is the research, part of it is strategy. I always felt that you love people with truth. Truth is necessary. I'm not going to lie to people. Accuracy is the best gift I can give people, in line with strategy. So how do we get from here to there? And then what are what's the most true look, the most true story I can tell, to create a strategy to get from here to there? And a lot of that involves information.
Hmm.
Um, I'll tell you one story real quick. The A friend of mine, this didn't happen to me, but a friend of mine who is an account planner, he was doing some research. He reached out to a quantitative research company that does surveys. They'll call you, they'll send out surveys, pay people to take them, get responses. And he asked my friend, this vendor asked my friend, he said, okay, well, what do you want the result to be? And my friend Joel was like, what do you mean? What do I want the result to be? I want the truth. And so you can see how rife marketing and advertising, especially on the larger scale, is with this. It doesn't really matter. You can lie with data. I created a visualization the other day and I was like, well, this doesn't show the stark contrast that I want to show. Why don't I just zoom in the scale a little bit and make it look bigger? And then I thought, no, that would give the wrong impression. And I
Mm.
don't want to lie with data, right? And so what would did a, this gets to epistemology, epistemology, right? But how do we know what we know? And so we just talked about truth a lot, right? Well, how do we know what truth is? And did Aquinas talk about how we know what we know?
Um, well, I don't know fully the answer to that question, but I can answer you in some ways. Is that this is actually quite a common thing, I think, in the US. You have there is this concept called the natural law. Um, Call it your conscience in a way. That little voice that speaks inside your head telling you this is wrong. People have this even if they're not formed in a Christian or any religious upbringing. They have it even if they're atheist or agnostic, never have any contact with what you would consider to be philosophy or theology. And so I think that to a great extent, we all fundamentally know what's true inside ourselves with this little voice that we have in our heads, which kind of explains that no matter where you go in the world, we have some basic ideas about what is good and what is wrong, good and evil, sorry. So I think that's an element of it. And natural law, Aquinas would say, is part of the eternal law. And then from natural law, you have divine law, and then human law, which is in positive law, which is the acts of parliament and the laws that are passed through Congress and etc. And they should really all line up. But where they deviate, that's problematic. So how do we know what we know? I think is really the question that you're asking. Like, how do we know what is true and what isn't? Um, I think it's a very difficult question. I personally rely on Aquinas to reason that out with me, because very often what he does in his writings is that he'll put forward the biggest objections to his ideas at the start of his answers, and then he'll reason them through and explain why exactly they're wrong. And what he
Mm.
also does is he relies on uh, pagan philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, and then Jewish and Muslim scholars as well, who have glimpsed the truth through the natural law. And what he does is he orders all of those philosophers to the Gospels, to the Word of God. And
Can I ask you a can I can I ask you a question about that? Um, can you get worse at truth over time?
can you get worse at truth over time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's say I choose. So I've heard of people who were in prison and then they were convinced, like all the murders that I did, all those things that I did, they were for a greater good, right? They had convinced themselves that they were the ones somehow, right? These gangsters from the 20s in U.S. prisons, right? They convinced themselves that all that murder, everything they did was actually they're the victim. And so I'm wondering, can you over time can you internalize ideas that make you
Oh,
worse at finding
absolutely.
truth?
Yeah, I think we all do this to an extent, and it's very difficult not to. I mean, we do something wrong, um, and it's maybe too much to deal with. Maybe it's too much to handle. And so we go through a process of trying to justify it to ourselves that, yes, it's from this greater good. But there's something inside us that's telling us, no, it's not. That's actually wrong. But that's not convenient. It certainly doesn't help us sleep at night, which is probably the ultimate aim. And so we try to overcome it, and fool ourselves. I think there's a lot of capacity for self-delusion. I think we all have it. I think I've done it in the past for sure. Um, but it's just a question of trying to find a reliable guide to keep you back on track, something objective, which is outside your own will, your own tendency to find comfort. And I'm sure that somebody who's killed 30 people is probably struggling very deeply with this idea that they have done something horrifically wrong, and it's impossible to rectify that. So, what's the easiest solution? I just say it's for a greater good. You know, yeah.
I was misunderstood. Um, it was the other guy who moved his fence too far. Um, it's
Yeah.
uh, so let me test it. What if we got down to marketing and research, and I gave you a model and let you tell me how Aquinas would, or maybe we just abstract it to realism and just said whatever Aquinas says, but realism. How do we find truth? And we'll use the correspondence view of truth, which is truth corresponds with reality, versus other forms of truth where it's, like, well, oh, there's consensus. Oh, other people believe this too, so it must be true, and all these other ways to find truth, right? So we're looking for objectivity. So let me ask you this. I've been a big fan of, especially with smaller growing companies, of the first step is finding out our own internal, um, let's organize our own internal thoughts about what we think people need out there, who we are, almost kind of like a situation position analysis. How do we position against our competitors? And then what do we think people need from us, right? And we're just going with what we know inside. Maybe we'll talk to salespeople. Maybe we'll talk to, like the CEO, the COO. Everybody will give their opinion, right? And we start there, and we know. So I think the big mistake in my mind would be thinking that because we've done that, we now have all of the information we need to move forward. But I don't think you have to stay there. I think that can be the first step, and you can say, this is our working hypothesis. how do we test this hypothesis? Would you say that a realistic would that could be a realistic approach to start?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think that the misconception with realism is that once you've got the answer, that's it. But it's not like that. You do have to iterate, and you do get new information which will refine what you're believing and the conclusions that you come to over time. Um, and I think that really is a common misconception with people who believe in objective truth. They think, well, for example, they look at scientists and they say, well, the food pyramid, for example, was considered to be, whole grains were considered to be great, and then over time we realized that's not the case. And there was the issue with cholesterol, for example. You have to have, absolutely no fat in your milk, and that's the right way forward. And then that seemed to change over time. So idealists would look at that and say, look, see, you objectivists, you realists, thank God we're here to tell you, that you were off track. And I find that misunderstands what the realist is trying to do. The realist is absolutely willing to change their mind in the face of evidence, objective evidence. It's just a question of being able to be open to that and to receive it and to constantly iterate. I think a call center is a really good way of doing that. I think that every call center should be in the boardroom, right next to the boardroom. And I think the CEO, the CFO, CTO should be listening in on calls to hear immediately what the reaction is to what they're doing. Not some kind of unwanted expense that you have to do for public relations purposes, but actually as a way to constantly reorient yourself towards what is objectively true. I'm not the first person to say that. A guy called Rory Sutherland, chairman of Ogilvy, suggested that in a talk that I saw, and I thought that it was very insightful. So I think it is a constant process, and I don't think you actually ever really get there either. I don't think it's something where you can just stop and say, yeah, got it.
I agree. I've seen too many, heard too many stories about how just things change. They always change. You never cross the same river twice. And, I think there are a couple of issues there. I think one of them is that thinking like the food pyramid, okay, we're sure about that. All the science is in, let's say, we thought, right? Or cholesterol. All the science is in. Cholesterol correlates and therefore is a causal factor in, whatever. And so there's the overconfidence maybe. So there's overconfidence in what we think is true, and that's not necessarily a realist ideal maybe, or a realist requirement at all. Being sure about everything is not a realist requirement.
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is be able to ask questions and move forward, right? I think we need to use information that we have to move forward. So in my example of let's get an internally consistent view of what we think our market looks like, and then let's test it. We can always go out and test it, or maybe we move forward with it for now, but we're open. We're not convinced that this is static. We're not convinced that this isn't going to change. We're not convinced that we're not going to get a huge advantage 3 months from now when news comes out about something in our industry, right? Because what we're doing is we're listening. I think the other thing, so the first thing is being super sure about it. The second thing is, I think related to it, is just feeling like we have complete information before we do. In the food pyramid example, I think we thought we had all the information. In my example, I think we know we don't. And so there's kind of they share humility, but I think one of them is like, no, we've kind of answered all the questions we had. And in our situation, we're thinking, no, because we haven't really talked to our clients very much. And it goes to the call center example, which is where I think you and I kind of cross over a little bit, because I've asked you before, if you remember, hey, can the community be a source of qualitative information, right? Answers to questions we didn't know we needed to ask,
Mm-hmm.
which is a limitation of that internal internally consistent hypothesis. It's internally consistent. That's great. We're hearing from everybody internally. That's great. But we have to realize we're in an echo chamber a little bit.
Yeah. Also, I think it's often useful to anonymize the community feedback. But there is a tendency for community members to tell you what you want to hear. Because sometimes, they're aware that if they tell you something which doesn't align with what you believe, they don't want conflict, they don't want confrontation, they want to have a good relationship with you. So I think that if you anonymize it, and if you can really be sure, if they can really be sure they are anonymous, genuinely, then you're much more likely to get the unvarnished truth, rather than if you know who they
Yeah,
are.
and I think when you said they should be next to the call center, my mind went through this progression. It was like, oh well, why can't they just hear from someone, the manager of all the call centers who gathers all that information and presents it to them? But then you get into politics. But if you were to be next door to the call center, the CEO could just go through and say, oh, that guy always tells me the truth, right? That guy doesn't care. He's going to work somewhere else in 3 months anyway. Like,
Yeah, nothing to
um,
lose.
right. Like he has nothing, really not a whole lot to lose, but actually we're having these great conversations because I'm asking him, hey, what happens when people call about this? Oh yeah, well, that's a real problem. That is hard for me to explain in good conscience. Right. And now the CEO is like, okay, I wonder if that's true. So now the CEO can actually, you could write a survey at that point because you know the questions to ask. But, and so I think the next thing is after you create that internal consistency, because I do think that comes first, right? That internally consistent working hypothesis. I think the next step is you go out and you get the data, right? Whether that's, talking, and I've done this before many times, in different ways, qualitative research, going out and talking to people who use the product or the service, talking with, low-level employees and finding out, hey, tell me what's going on here. You've done that in different ways through interfacing with the community, right? Tell me a little more about how would you use a community to keep your feet on the ground, right? Keep you touching grass, as they say.
Well, ultimately, these are the people who interact with your product and your services and everything that you do. The initial idea that you had when you established that organization, that love that you have for them, should be for the idea for the product should be reflected in the people who are using the product. So there are so many ways you can harness the community to, as you say, keep your feet on the ground. Product feedback is probably the most important one. Testing ideas, testing ideas and getting ideas on what to do next. For example, what new products to launch. Complaints. You really want to keep your people who are complaining, or social media, broadcasting to the world. You ideally want them in a private community which you've established where they can have a direct line to you. Very often people will go off on one if they feel as if they're not being listened to, or if they've been let down, or if they've been insulted in some way. And so the community is damage limitation in a lot of respects. It's also your most powerful advocacy engine. Very often organizations rely on paid ads and all sorts of paid campaigns and things like that. But I mean, I can only speak for myself that I've never bought anything from an ad, as far as I can see, not directly anyway. I may have seen an ad and it may have seeded an idea in my mind, and I might have thought maybe 3 or 4 months later that I'll buy something. But genuinely, really, what makes me act pretty much quickly and instantly is if my good friend, someone like yourself, Chris, sends me a message and says, hey, check this out. And I'm thinking, right, I know Chris, I trust him. He's got my best interests at heart. He has nothing to gain from this. He's not getting a commission from it. There's no reason why Chris would be lying to me right now. And And so I'm going to look into that. Whereas if I saw an ad, I'd be thinking all sorts of things. I'd be thinking, what kind of manipulation is this? I don't trust these people. They just want my money. They don't care about me. So if you have like 500 to 1,000 Chris's out there talking to their friends and family and co-workers and colleagues, everybody who they come across who have a strong connection with, I think that's just incredibly powerful. But the only way they won't be motivated enough to do that is if they themselves feel a connection with what the organization is doing. And I think that this is the real power of a community. You multiply a marketing department by orders of magnitude, and it's far cheaper if it's done properly, though.
Okay. So I am very interested in that. I took um a grad in grad school. I took a class that was on social media and communities, and we touched on some of these things. And we see successful communities out there that are doing this very thing, and I think that it's more practical than people realize. Because again, what we're trying to do from an operational standpoint. I mean, I was a COO at a branding agency. And so I cared about brand because it was sustainable and could grow over time, right? You're making promises that you can build future proof, right? In my mind, building community and having a really good way to build and maintain and sustain a community future proofs your company. And I remember them talking about, hey, if you have a community that trusts you, they will fight for you. So if someone says something on social media about how bad your product is, they will go out there, and we've seen that happen, right?
Yeah, you see it happen all the time, and you cannot buy that level of PR mitigation. You can't buy it because everyone watching is like, this guy is not paid by the company. He's not an employee. He's out there going to bat, probably, while he's out shopping with his wife on the phone doing it. Why would he do that? Why? It's because he saw something that I didn't see. He's connected in some way that I can't possibly fathom, and it's genuine. It must be. Whereas if you have some big PR organization coming out with some polished paragraphs and things like that, you just think, well, it's just the same old nonsense. I don't believe a word of it,
Hmm.
and I think it's just a huge waste of money. Just my feeling.
Yeah, and I'd like to say one more thing. There's this phrase, perception is reality. And I want to test this against realism as well,
Yes.
because in marketing, I think there's a way to properly understand that and a way to improperly understand it. And so, as with any short, pithy sayings, it can be misunderstood and read different ways. But it can be misunderstood like this: oh, if someone perceives it in our audience, that must be the reality. So a lot of times people get confused in branding, especially
Yeah.
because they say branding is what people think about you.
Yeah.
And okay, there's some truth to that, but you have control over it. And so, but the real way to look at it, because you have control over branding, because it's either true or not for you. The best thing you can do is get closer to it and write definitions that are testable, right? And so perception is reality. Oh, whatever they think, that's true. No, whatever they think, the right way to look at it, whatever they think is their perception, and we care about their perception in the same way that when I was teaching, I cared about the perception of my students. Not because I wanted to lie to them. It was because what I was trying to do was get them to, I would meet them where they're at so I could bring them to truth and a true understanding of things. In the same way, I think good brands can use this idea of perception versus reality properly understood to say, okay, well, we understand that people think this about us. That is now our marketing challenge, right? It's not something where, oh, we're going to pander to that, or we're going to keep them thinking that. No, that's now our marketing challenge, and we're going to stand out by busting that myth and helping people understand truth, because truth is a way better story to tell, way more
Absolutely.
interesting for people than if I were just to be politically correct and just do what's expected.
And I think that you've explained that very well. That is the biggest obstacle I get actually when I talk about the importance of objective truth. And when people see me criticizing subjectivity, they think it includes that, but it doesn't. How people perceive something is important, and it can, and there is an objective truth to be found in it. And it's very difficult actually to explain that. And I think you just did a wonderful job. But just one example I can think of is there was a train line. I forget which one it was now. The journey time was something like 3 hours. And they wanted to reduce the journey time to I think 2.5 hours, cut 30 minutes off. They spent about $1 billion on the tracks and the signaling and everything like that to reduce it. But there was one marketing consultant who said, well, why don't you just hire the world's top supermodels, and serve the people on the train champagne, during their journey. They're not going to care about that extra 30 minutes. They'll be actually quite happy to do it. And you could save a fraction of that money. There's just some, obviously it's a bit ridiculous, but there is a kernel of truth in it, because it really is all down to the perception of the people on that train. If they're enjoying themselves for 3 hours, they're not going to care if they're not enjoying themselves for 2 hours, 30 minutes and enjoying themselves for 3 hours. It's not, that's the key difference really, I think,
Yeah, it's and that goes back to innovation, because they weren't solving the right problem. They, so in, let's see, when you're talking to your community, yeah, you're looking for suggestions, but you're also looking for problems, because they don't know. This is where innovation comes in. Your community doesn't necessarily know what you're willing and able to do. So Henry Ford, I think, famously said, if you asked people what they wanted, they would have just said a faster horse, right? I mean,
right.
But what we're talking about is the value of research, the value of getting to the truth, right? Is finding out what's the real problem we're solving for people. And we may think, oh, it's speed objectively, because I'm an engineer and everything, everything I see is a nail because I have a hammer, or kind of thing. And so we saw this recently with, I think it was Mercedes, or was it in Formula One? So they're going through, they have new specs for the engines, right? And so I think its compression ratio was the I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Oliver, but the compression ratio, the compression, so the engines have to be smaller, right? So they're like, well, we'll measure compression ratio. Everyone's like, okay, well, the engines have to be smaller, so we'll just miniaturize everything around, and so that the compression ratio is within the bounds. What Mercedes did was they said, well, how are they measuring? And they found out that they're measuring cold compression ratio. And so they said, okay, well, what if we made it to where when the car is cold, when the motor is cold, that's the compression ratio. But now we're gonna use parts that are particularly responsive to heat. And so they placed these parts in the motor to where it lengthened the compression. It improved the compression ratio, and so they're getting something like from 16 to 18, I think. And so they an appreciable difference in power, because they said, okay, what's the problem we're really trying to solve?
Mm.
It's not, oh, the motor has to be smaller. You know what I mean? Right? Because that's what, oh, you know what I mean? It becomes an emotional thing,
Mm-hmm.
and not something well-defined. Like, well, how are we measuring it? Right.
Yeah.
And so now Mercedes is going to have a faster, anybody who uses Mercedes engines is going to have a faster car once it's warmed up, which is probably most of the race. Right.
Yeah.
So,
No, I think it's absolutely right. You have to sometimes what people say isn't necessarily what's wrong as well.
right.
They can't quite articulate it, or, maybe they just say what everyone else is saying, but then when you come down to it, probably turns out to be something completely different. And there are various reasons, I think, why people don't do that. Or sometimes just they don't know, or sometimes they feel embarrassed to say. Um, but yeah, I think that it's difficult working with people to try to get to the root cause of these things. Do you have any ideas or suggestions about how to elicit that, how to overcome that problem? When you're looking for feedback about what's genuinely the case, what's true, how
Yeah.
do you separate what people say from what's really wrong?
Yeah.
Good question, I know, but do you have any ideas on that?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. The so in qualitative research, they use it's a whole different language. So you're looking for it's not like quantitative research where you're looking for generalizability, statistical significance, and things like that. The requirement in qualitative research is saturation. You're not talking to 100 people or a particular percentage of that population you're trying to sample. You're talking to, yeah, they do kind of need to be in that, in that sample, but you're talking to like 12 to 15, 16 people. And what you're doing is what you're trying to do is say, hey, tell me about your day, right? So like with with the Got Milk campaign, there was a whole story about it, right? About how they got to that insight, which in the United States, it was the California Fluid Milk Advisory Board or something. I can't remember what they're called, but they commissioned, I think it was Ogilvy. No, not Ogilvy. It was Goodby, Silverstein and Partners at the time. I don't know what they're called now. A San Francisco agency, and John Steele was on the account, and he's an awesome planner and thinker. So, and so what they did was for example, they thought, through interviews, they found out that really the problem with not having milk is it's not having milk. It's not like, oh, milk is good for you. When we were younger, we saw, you know, well, I'm small now, and but I'm drinking milk, and pretty soon I'm going to be big now, big and be able to do, sports and all this stuff. It's not that it's good for you. That's not what people respond to. What they respond to is, I have a cookie now, and now I don't have any milk. Or like the Raymond Burr, there was this guy was a Raymond Burr expert, and he had Raymond Burr all over his picture of Raymond Burr. He was a historian, obviously, right? Looked like a nerd, looked the part, and he was listening to the radio. And for $1 million, who's the whatever Raymond Burr is known for? Um, and he had just taken a bite of like a peanut butter sandwich,
Yeah.
and so he didn't have any milk. So he got on the phone and he was like, "Rrr, rrr, rrr." So, and it was like for $1 million or something like that. And so all these stories about milk deprivation, right? You can't get milk. You have a cookie. Your enemy gave you a cookie, but he knows you don't have any milk, right? Um, and so, but how do you commit to that kind of strategy and that kind of insight? Well, you have to. You're looking for answers to questions you didn't know you needed to ask by asking open-ended questions, letting people talk their way to it, and not guiding them too much.
Right.
And so, I will hear an insight in the first interview, and I'll say, "That's really interesting. I wonder if other people are going to talk about that." And so, what I do in the next interview is I don't try to make them talk about it, but I give them the opportunity. I open it up for them, and they usually talk about it. It's kind of like in class when the teacher says, "Hey, if you have it, there are no dumb questions. If you have a question, someone else probably has that same question. They're too afraid to ask it." Through qualitative research, I believe those teachers are right, because there are so many things. And what you're looking for is saturation. You're looking for multiple people to start talking about that same thing, and you're listening for how they characterize it and exactly what kind of problem it is for them. You're looking for problems. You're not necessarily looking for solutions. You're looking for the problem that you didn't know you needed to ask about. Super powerful. Whoever does this gets a huge advantage in an industry where you're not doing this already.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing holds true in using your community as well for that, because you can
Yeah.
do that.
a brilliant explanation, and thank you for actually explaining how that really works in practice. I think the issue with the online community is one of the drawbacks I should mention is that it's very rare to come across a situation where you can just free will with somebody like that to get to a problem after extended communication. Usually, you're talking online typing. Occasionally, you might have a call, but it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, but the best way to elicit this kind of information is face to face, in person.
Yes, but you already have, if you have a community, you already have your group of people. You already know who's going to be honest with you by how they communicate. I mean, it's a great uh, sample bed, I guess. I don't know how you'd say that, but
Well,
it's a
yeah,
great place to be able to get people to talk about it who
exactly.
want to, and it's not going to cost you nearly as much to do the research because of that.
Mhm. No, that's true. Yeah. People do speak more freely as well when they're in groups of people who they feel comfortable with, who they've known for a long time. They can just say something like, it's not in the fridge and I had a cookie. And it could just come out, in a
Yeah,
non-pressured situation. And yeah, I think that you're quite right. It can happen. But I just do think that any online community should have an in-person element as well, somehow factored in. I think it does make a huge difference to actually meet somebody face to face. And I think there is a too much of a tendency to it to all be online. We do calls, you and I, occasionally, which
mhm.
is great. I would love you even better to meet you in person in the US. Um, Messaging, I think, backwards and forwards does leave a lot to be desired sometimes. So, that is one area which I think that community building could be improved. And
Yeah. Someday you're going to make it over here, and I'm going to give you the biggest hug you've ever had.
no, I've got a job. I would love that for sure. I'd love to go to the US. I think it's an incredible country. Uh, us Brits, we consider you to be our closest cousins. And yeah, I mean, America is just so fantastic in so many ways, really. But the European Union is not going as well, unfortunately. But hopefully there'll be some kind of turnaround. Again, it's to do with the fact that truth is not considered objective. There's a lot of idealists in Europe, but we have noticed that across the pond, as it were, the realism is making a comeback, and there are
Good.
plenty of organizations now who are starting to realize this, and we're all
I hope
watching.
so. I hope
Yeah.
so because I think um, I really don't think, I really don't think you can love people without knowing legitimately what constitutes good, because how do I give them what's good? I've had times where just, I've had times where I've had a falling out with somebody. And so in my morning prayer time, I will pray the best things for them, all the things. I won't pray, oh Lord, smite them so that they would know, see things my way. I'm just like, bless their family. I want God to bless their career. I want them to make more money than me. I'm just all the things that could possibly be jealousy or any kind of thing in my heart because I want truth, right? I want truth, right? And I want it in my own heart too, and I don't want to lie to myself.
Mhm.